Your federal income taxes will not be going up on January 1. Late last night, the House voted to extend the Bush-era tax cuts for 2 years.
But many Democrats still aren't happy with the compromise. Ephraim Graham has the story.
That we continue to borrow and steal.
It took months of fierce negotiation and contentious compromises, and many Democrats fought up to the very last minute.
What this bill represents is a complete surrender of democratic principles.
This bill will kill our children with very little input or benefit at the moment.
In the end, enough Democrats held their noses and voted for the bill, which keeps Americans from facing a tax hike in just 2 weeks. The $858 billion plan extends the Bush tax cuts for all Americans, extends unemployment benefits for about 9 million Americans, and gives $400 billion in tax cuts and credits aimed at boosting the economy.
This tax deal is not perfect.
Republicans call it the best deal they could get right now, and the president agrees.
This isn't an abstract debate. This is real money for real people. It will make a real difference in the lives of the folks who sent us here.
Meanwhile, in the Senate,
this is exactly the kind of thing the American people voted against last November. Just this kind of thing.
Republicans forced Democrats to put the brakes on that $1.2 trillion omnibus spending bill, loaded with thousands of lawmakers' pet projects, better known as earmarks.
Here's the bill. It spends right at 2,000 pages in this bill. It spends $500 million a page.
Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid now says he'll work with Republicans on a shorter-term funding bill. Ephraim Graham, CBN News.
I'm not particularly happy with the compromise either, because I don't think it accomplishes what either side thinks it's going to accomplish. Now, the good news is for the average American, let's say you're making $50,000 a year, your paycheck is not going to get cut after the new year. If the tax breaks had not been extended for another 2 years, you would have seen a $200 per paycheck reduction in your take-home pay. That would be significant for most Americans, and you know, thankfully that's not going to happen. But there's a much larger issue here, and that has to do with our federal deficit. And when you look at the past election, what part of that doesn't either party get that we have to reduce spending? And so in this compromise, where is the reduction in spending in order to pay for the tax benefits that average Americans need and the economy needs to keep going? Without reduction in spending, we are spending ourselves into oblivion in the federal government. Now, let me give you a startling statistic, and it comes from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, in their weekly economic report. They predict in 2020, that's just 10 years from now, our average federal deficit, and this is with no stimulus spending, this is just going back to normal, is going to be $1.4 trillion a year. And in order to stop that, they would have to completely eliminate Medicare, Medicaid, in order to pay for it. You don't get the job done by eliminating all military spending. You don't get the job done by eliminating all discretionary spending. You can only solve that budget problem by eliminating Medicare and Medicaid. Now, we're facing some very tough choices as a society, and it looks like we have elected representatives that don't want to pay attention to it. If at the same time you're passing and extending tax cuts, you would then put forth a huge spending bill with all these earmarks, what are you doing? And are you not paying attention to the much bigger problem? That said, even when you count all the earmarks, $8 billion seems like a big number, but when you compare that to $1.4 trillion, it seems very small. We've got to come to some real serious, wake up and smell the coffee moments, or we're spending ourselves away. And if we don't wake up soon, well, the rest of the world is going to wake us up, because they're going to say, we're not going to buy your debt anymore. I don't care what interest rate you charge, and you're going to devalue your currency, and then you're going to see some real problems. This is This is serious, and we need to wake up to it, and we need to demand that our representatives start cutting spending and cut it in very real ways. Lee Webb has the rest of our top stories from the CBN Newsroom. Lee?
Gordon, it now appears Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid has enough votes to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. The Senate is expected to vote this weekend on the measure that would let gays serve openly in the military. CBN News Chief Political Correspondent David Brody has more.
Don't look now, but the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell looks like it's about to become a done deal. The top Republican on the House Armed Services Committee, Buck McKeon, tells CBN News that this will be a terrible mistake.
Why would we want to take the risk of any kind of experiment like this?
McKeon points to the Pentagon's own report on the effects of the repeal, which show that roughly 12% of spouses said they would encourage their spouse to get out of the military if this law was changed.
That's a pretty big number. I would wonder about the effect on readiness and morale and so forth.
Yet despite dogged opposition from conservatives and some top military personnel who say the policy could lead to chaos and put American troops in danger, Nancy Pelosi still mustered enough votes in the House to pass a bill. Now Harry Reid looks like he has the votes to pass it in the Senate as well.
For those who can vote to appease a small base of Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, to appease them and sacrifice the lives of young Marines who are putting their life on the line for this nation, I don't know how they can live with that, knowing that the blood of those young Marines would be on their hands.
To repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Senate's going to need at least 60 votes. To get there, they'll need 4 Republicans to join in with the Democrats. So conservatives will no doubt be taking note of the GOP Gang of 4 who have announced their support for the repeal. Susan Collins, Scott Brown, Lisa Murkowski, and the ultimate conservative nemesis, Olympia Snowe. Democrats and gay rights groups have been able to gain additional support because they've been successful at framing this as a civil rights issue. But another factor has been the support of Defense Secretary Robert Gates. That leaves Tony Perkins, a former Marine, extremely disappointed.
I think he's caved under the pressure of this administration. I've spoken to a number of military leaders, both active duty and retired, who have had great respect for him, but have lost it in the wake of this debate.
Yet this debate looks like it's going to end with a gay rights victory and President Obama's signature. David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
20 more states have challenged President Obama's health care overhaul in court. Their attorneys told a federal judge in Pensacola, Florida, that it will expand the government's powers in dangerous and unintended ways, like forcing people to obtain health insurance.
This is the biggest encroachment upon our freedom that Congress has ever levied, and if Congress has the power to force Americans to go out and buy something, Americans will lose their freedom.
Earlier this week, a federal judge in Virginia ruled that health care reform is unconstitutional. That case, along with the one in Florida, likely to end up before the U.S. Supreme Court. Al-Qaeda is planning suicide attacks against the U.S. and Europe this Christmas season. That report comes from the confessions of captured terrorists in Iraq. The Iraqi Interior Minister says the botched bombing in Stockholm, Sweden last weekend was among those alleged plots. The Iraqi Foreign Minister calls those claims a critical threat. A scientist who applied for a job at the University of Kentucky now says he didn't get the job because he's a Christian. Martin Gaskell was considered a top candidate for a prestigious position at the Student Observatory at UK. One member of the search committee said he was breathtakingly above other applicants, but other members of the committee said he was something close to a creationist and potentially evangelical. Gaskell's lawsuit against the school goes to trial in February. Prejudice against Christian scientists is nothing new. The movie Expelled, released a few years ago, exposed other cases of religious discrimination in the scientific community. Pope Benedict says Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world. He cited the recent attack on a Catholic cathedral in Iraq and the exodus of Christians there. Christian author and journalist David Aikman tells CBN News that most Americans are not aware of abuses against the church around the world.
For 2 or 3 generations now, we've had elite universities basically teaching their undergraduates that the only villains in history who oppressed others for religious reasons were the Christians. And the Crusades are always brought up. So knowledge of Christian communities in different countries of the world is extremely poorly taught in American colleges and schools.
And you can see our full interview with David Aikman at cbnnews.com. Gordon?
And what caused the Pope to speak out was the horrible massacre in the church in Baghdad, where gunmen come in during the middle of a service and start shooting worshipers. One young girl went up to one of them before they started shooting, mistook him for her uncle, and wrapped her arms around his leg and gave him a big hug. And what did he do? He shot her in between the eyes. That's the kind of violence that the church is facing, and we've got to be in prayer for our brothers and sisters around the world. But when you look at what could have happened in Iraq, and this is our own government did it, where they said Sharia is now part of the Constitution. Once you legislate that and make that part of the constitutional law of the land, well, this is what you reap.
2 men in East Texas have admitted they're responsible for a series of church fires earlier this year. 20-year-old Jason Bork and 22-year-old Daniel McAllister pleaded guilty to 5 counts of arson. The two were arrested in February after fires destroyed or damaged 10 churches. No one was hurt in the blazes, but prosecutors are asking for life in prison for the pair. 43 people died in the fire that swept across northern Israel last month. That fire forcing thousands to evacuate their homes. Operation Blessing quickly responded. OB volunteers worked alongside police and rescue teams to distribute water to victims. The ministry also teamed up with a group called IsraAid. Crews distributed clothes, blankets, food, toys, mattresses, and generators to families. Operation Blessing's coordinator in Israel says the families were extremely grateful for that help. And you can find out more about Operation Blessing by going to its website at ob.org.